I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. So we've turned now to Joseph Campbell's analysis of the hero's journey, which is especially pertinent to this class about a hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. In his famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he says, "The standard path of the mythological adventure of the hero is a magnification of the formula represented in the rites of passage. Separation, initiation, and return, which might be named the nuclear unit of the monomyth. A hero ventures forth from the world of the common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man." So this class is itself a hero's journey. We've gone from the common day understanding of ourselves as these material bodies walking around in 3 dimensions of space down a linear timeline to the land of the dead, for example, with Carl Jung's near-death experience, a realm of supernatural wonder, the cosmic horizon where the past, the present, and the future are conserved at each point, and furthermore, all of the archetypes of the collective unconscious mind reside out at that realm, the region of supernatural wonder. That parallel between Carl Jung's near-death experience and holographic string theory results in the psyche equals singularity equation, the synthesis of Jungian psychology, which represents the entire accumulation of philosophical history from Plato, the synthesis of that with Susskind's holographic string theory, which represents the accumulation of the history of physics leading back to Plato through Newton, and then the entire march of 20th century physics. Combining those two can be distilled into the psyche equals singularity equation, and that is the boon on which you can return to your fellow man after taking this class to help people realize that we are all one with the omnicentric singularity, to serve whom is the goal of life. So if you look to the left, this image of the hero's journey, separation, you leave the common day, everyday conception of yourself, then you're initiated into this knowledge of eternity, and then you return, and you share your knowledge with the rest of the world. So there's the hero's journey. The hero's journey, spiritual center of gravity. According to Joseph Campbell, the first stage of the mythological journey, which we have designated the call to adventure, signifies that destiny has summoned the hero and transformed his spiritual center of gravity from within the pale of his society to a zone unknown. The spiritual center of gravity is the same as the physical center of gravity of the universe. It's the omnicentric singularity. Here's a quote from Sean Kelly, who was the chair of my dissertation committee at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His book title is Individuation and the Absolute, Hegel, Jung, and the Path Toward Wholeness. That's obviously pertinent to this class. According to Dr. Sean Kelly, gradually the center of gravity shifts from the ego to the self. Carl Jung defined the ego as the center of the field of light, and he described the self archetype as the center of both the conscious ego and the collective unconscious mind. I'm equating the collective unconscious mind with the cosmic horizon where all of the archetypes reside, and the conscious ego I'm equating with the omnicentric singularity. The self is simultaneously the central point and the encompassing horizon. The self archetype is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, and itself unites 2 opposing poles, the conscious ego side and the collective unconscious mind. But the point here for this slide is that when you go on the hero's journey, the spiritual center of gravity shifts from the pale of your society where your conscious ego dominates to a zone unknown, and that zone unknown is the collective unconscious mind, and I'm saying that the center of gravity in the zone unknown is the omnicentric singularity, which is the archetype of the self. The picture here is of Jesus. He left the pale of his society and fasted for 40 days and nights out in the desert, after which he returned to society and began his public ministry. Black hole equals belly of the whale, the hero's journey. So according to Joseph Campbell, the idea that the passage of the magical threshold is a transit into a sphere of rebirth is symbolized in the worldwide womb image of the belly of the whale. The hero, instead of conquering or conciliating the power of the threshold, is swallowed into the unknown and would appear to have died. This popular motif gives emphasis to the lesson that the passage of the threshold is a form of self-annihilation. The temple interior, the belly of the whale, and the heavenly land beyond, above, and below the confines of the world are one and the same. So during his near-death experience, Jung merged with the heavenly land beyond, above, and below the confines of the world. That's similar to being swallowed by the whale, the myth of Jonah and the whale. Jonah refused his heroic mission that God wanted him to perform, so eventually God arranged for him to be thrown off a ship and swallowed by a big fish. And that is an archetypal representation, says Jung, of entering into this zone unknown. So Carl Jung's NDE with the Black Hindu in the Black Rock Temple gave him insight into the heavenly land of the cosmic horizon beyond, above, and below the confines of the world. Harvard physicist Andrew Strominger explains that black holes are the key to taking the next step. They're the doorway to our next step in understanding the basic laws of the universe around us. To be swallowed by the psyche equals singularity equation is similar to being swallowed by a black hole. Your common everyday understanding of yourself as a conscious ego walking around in a material body gets swallowed and destroyed, annihilated, and then is reborn as an understanding that you are one with the omnicentric singularity, which is the God archetype. The hero's journey, the Jonah Syndrome. So we're returning to Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, where he's quoting Abraham Maslow, who said, "We fear our highest possibility as well as our lowest ones. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves in such peak moments, and yet we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe, and fear before these very same possibilities." So we fear what we can become. Each of us is one with the omnicentric gravitational singularity. Every quantum particle is also correlated with a wave of probability, with a peak and a valley. We fear our godlike peaks and our lowest moments, because they seem to expand the normal understanding of who we are so far that we disintegrate. And that leads to what Becker calls the Jonah Syndrome. The Jonah Syndrome is partly a justified fear of being torn apart, of losing control, of being shattered and disintegrated, even of being killed by the experience, self-crippling defenses against grandiosity. So, in the hero's journey, you might be frozen with fear by the Jonah Syndrome. You don't want to be torn apart and disintegrated. You don't want to have your everyday common understanding of who you are ripped apart by some vicious whale. And it's a justifiable fear, as we will discuss in the next slide. Danger of identifying as the hero. Ego explosion. So here's a couple of quotes from Carl Jung. The archetype corresponding to the situation is activated, and as a result those explosive and dangerous forces hidden in the archetype come into action, frequently with unpredictable consequences. There is no lunacy people under the domination of an archetype will not fall prey to. And then he says elsewhere, many fathomless transformations of personality, like sudden conversions and other far-reaching changes of mind, originate in the attractive power of a collective image, which can cause such a high degree of inflation that the entire personality is disintegrated. So the hero's journey. The hero is one of the archetypes of the collective unconscious mind. All of the archetypes are infinitely powerful. They are all absolute parts and parcels of the supreme archetype of the self. If we identify ourselves with an archetype, then we put ourselves in grave danger of having an ego explosion, because our little conscious ego, tapping into this eternal archetypal image, will inflate suddenly and explode. Relating this back to the Jonah Syndrome, this is what people are afraid of, falling prey to grandiosity and having such an explosive ego inflation that they lose themselves in insanity. So that is a danger on the hero's journey. What I'm arguing is that we shouldn't identify with any one particular archetype. We should identify ourselves as absolute but subordinate parts and parcels of the omnicentric singularity. That archetype is the archetype of the Big Bang. That is the archetype of explosive creation. We are not God, we are God's servants. And when we realize that, we will feel this inflationary energy, but we should be protected from an ego explosion if we remain humble and see ourselves as the servant of God. That's the goal, according to Ernest Becker's estimation of 20th century psychology. That's the goal, according to Kierkegaard. We should take a leap of faith in the seemingly absurd belief that the infinitely powerful God is concerned with finite human beings infinitely. That realization should protect us from the danger of being devoured by the archetypes that we're trying to learn about and serve. Back and forth across the horizon of the world, according to Joseph Campbell, in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he says, the hero whose attachment to ego is already annihilated passes back and forth across the horizon of the world, in and out of the dragon, as readily as a king through all the rooms of his house. And therein lies his power to save, for his passing and returning demonstrate that through all the contraries of phenomenality, the uncreated imperishable remains, and there is nothing to fear. So I say Carl Jung was called back to Earth from the horizon of the world by the subtle form of Dr. H. He passed back and forth across the cosmic horizon for the next 3 weeks during his nightly ecstasies. So Carl Jung's near-death experience in 1944, he found himself 1,000 miles above the Earth. He could look down and see the clouds and the reddish sands of Arabia. He encountered the black rock temple with the black Hindu in a white robe sitting in lotus posture. He believed he would learn about the past, present, and future of his entire career of incarnations if he were to enter into the brilliantly lit room in the back of that black rock temple. When he was about to enter that temple, the subtle form of his doctor, whom he calls Dr. H, rose above the earth and called him back. Jung claims that it seemed to him as if the earth had deputized his doctor to retrieve him because he still had some service on earth to perform. Then for the next 3 weeks he would wake up every night for an hour at midnight, and he would have these ecstatic visions of all of the archetypes out at the cosmic horizon. He said it seemed to him as if the past, present, and future were interwoven at the cosmic horizon, and that each of us lives in our own little cube of illusion tethered to the horizon. Carl Jung said it seemed to him, after his near-death experience and the nightly visions, that the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point of the cosmic horizon, and that each of us is imprisoned in our own little three-dimensional cube of illusion, which is tethered to the horizon of the thread. So the point is, Carl Jung went to the horizon of the Earth, and then he traveled to the horizon of the cosmos, and his ability to come back to the Earth and recall what he learned about what he calls the pleroma, the horizon of the cosmos, that's what makes him a hero. It seems that that's why Earth brought him back, to share this information, that all the contraries of phenomenality in the material world, they're all united in this uncreated, imperishable cosmic horizon. The realization of our unity with the omnicentric singularity, which also exists out at the horizon of the cosmos, which is the collective unconscious mind. I'm saying that is the realization that we can draw from Carl Jung's near-death experience, and the point for this slide is that going back and forth across the horizon of the world, in the ultimate sense of the cosmic horizon, is how we can perform our heroics for God on earth today, and as always throughout history. Hero centered in the central source of the world. So Joseph Campbell in The Hero with a Thousand Faces says the hero of action is the agent of the cycle, continuing into the living moment the impulse that first moved the world. Since he is now centered in the source, he makes visible the repose and harmony of the central place. He is a reflection of the world axis from which the concentric circles spread. The world mountain, the world tree, he is the perfect microcosmic mirror of the macrocosm. So I say the singularity of the Big Bang is the impulse that first moved the world, from which the concentric circles of space-time spread. The hero of action makes visible the psyche equals singularity equation and serves as the agent of the historical cycle away from and back to Plato's idea of the good. The gravitational singularity is a perfect microcosmic mirror of the macrocosm because the macrocosm emerges from the singularity and the macrocosm is contained within the singularity at each point of the cosmic horizon. A transmutation of the whole social order. A transmutation of the whole social order is necessary so that through every detail and act of secular life, the vitalizing image of the universal God-man who is actually immanent and effective in all of us may be somehow made known to consciousness. And this is not a work that consciousness itself can achieve. Consciousness can no more invent or even predict an effective symbol than foretell or control tonight's dream. The whole thing is being worked out on another level. I say, psyche equals singularity is the effective symbol that emerged from the history of academia to trigger a transmutation of the whole social order by making the God archetype in us all known to consciousness. So we can't just invent an effective symbol. Becker said the same thing in Denial of Death, that it must emerge naturally from the historical context, and I'm saying that that has come to pass. And that with this natural emergence of the synthesis of Susskind's holographic string theory and Jung's archetypal psychology, and that synthesis can be expressed in the psyche equals singularity equation, that is what can produce a transmutation of the whole social order. The center of gravity has definitely shifted. The modern hero task. Continuing with the hero with 1,000 faces, Campbell says the way to become a human is to learn to recognize the lineaments of God in all of the wonderful modulations of the face of man. With this we come to the final hint of what the specific orientation of the modern hero task must be, and discover the real cause for the disintegration of all of our inherited religious formula. The center of gravity, that is to say, of the realm of mystery and danger, has definitely shifted. He gives the examples, which I paraphrase, from the divine spheres of astrology to the 17th century mechanical worldview of astronomy, to the 19th century Darwinian biology, to the 20th century focus on man himself in psychology. Then he continues, live, Nietzsche says, as though the day were here. It is not society that is to guide and save the creative hero, but precisely the reverse. And I say the center of gravity in academic physics has shifted to the literal center of black holes and the universe, which, according to Jung's leap day equation, is the psyche itself. The leap day equation is the psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. Cultivating the knowledge that psyche equals singularity in oneself, and then using that knowledge to guide and save a misguided society, is the modern hero task, most aligned with Hegel's theory of the idea realizing itself through history and Jung's theory of individuation.
Campbell on the Book of Job, category shattering almighty center. So here, Joseph Campbell's going to comment on the biblical Book of Job, which is a story about a man named Job who was wealthy and he had a lot of children. He was well respected and he was a very pious man. And according to the story, God is talking to Satan in heaven and telling Satan, look at my wonderful servant Job, he would never speak ill of me. So Satan says, Job only praises you, God, because you've given him wealth and happiness. If you took that away from him, then he'd curse you. So they make a bet, and God allows Satan to kill Job's children and then cover Job with painful boils so that he ends up sitting in a pile of ashes. And although he never curses God, he does question God's sense of justice. And the picture you see here to the left, his three friends tell him, you must have done some horrible sin to deserve this. It's got to be your fault. But Job insists, no, I've been pious my whole life. I've always praised God. Even when he killed my children, I said, well, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Now all I want is death. I'm covered in these painful and grotesque sores, and I'm an outcast, and I wish I could just die, but I can't even die. And then finally God responds and says to Job in a whirlwind with a lightning and thunderstorm appearance, saying, what do you know about my almighty power? And that convinced Job to repent. And he admitted, it's true, I know nothing about God's sense of justice. So let me just read what Campbell says. There is no word of explanation, no mention of the dubious wager with Satan described in chapter 1 of the book of Job. Only a thunder and lightning demonstration of the fact of facts, namely that man cannot measure the will of God, which derives from a center beyond the range of human categories. So I'm saying that center beyond the range of human categories is the gravitational singularity, which is where the laws of physics break down, and that quote from Stephen Hawking I have at the bottom. But continuing here, Campbell says, categories indeed are totally shattered by the Almighty of the book of Job, and remain shattered to the last. Nevertheless, to Job himself, the revelation appears to have made soul-satisfying sense. He was a hero who, by his courage in the fiery furnace, had proven himself capable of facing a greater revelation than the one that satisfied his friends. So his friends were following the normal, everyday sense of justice, which is that if you're being punished by God, then you must have committed some sin. There's a clear cause and effect law occurring here, and so it's got to be your fault. And Job says, nope, that's simply not the case. I've been pious my whole life, so I don't know what God is doing, that he's allowing all kinds of evils on the world. If you stop and think about it for a second, the powerful are always oppressing the weak. God doesn't punish them, but he punishes the weak. Where is God's justice? And this kind of questioning of God's justice provokes God to appear to Job as this whirlwind of cosmic proportions, and that humbles Job because he realizes God is beyond my categories of justice. He's beyond my categories of the understanding of what is good, and he's the center beyond the range of human categories. It's the idea of the good. It's the source of all archetypal categories. It's the archetype of archetypes, and it's beyond any other description. It's infinite, and it entails all meaning, but itself cannot be defined. So here's the quote from Stephen Hawking. Both the Big Bang and black holes would contain singularities, places where space and time come to an end and the laws of physics break down. So it makes sense to equate the gravitational singularity as the cosmic manifestation of the psychological archetype of the idea of God. They're both the central source of all of the other archetypes, and they are the realm where human categories break down. But this idea of the book of Job, questioning God's justice, well, after Job repents, then God blesses him with more children and wealth and heals him of his sores, and he lives happily ever after. But we're going to see in the next slide that Carl Jung brings up the idea of God's unconscious mind. Jung's answer to Job, God's unconscious mind. So Jung wrote a book, Answer to Job, in the 1950s, and he analyzes the story of Job, and he comes to the conclusion that it reveals God's unconscious mind. So let me just read what Jung says, and then I'll analyze it. He says, in his answer to Job, Jung says, it is impossible for the consciousness of a good God to produce evil deeds. Divine unconsciousness and lack of reflection, on the other hand, enable us to form a conception of God which puts his actions beyond moral judgment and allows no conflict to arise between goodness and beastliness. And then later, in Answer to Job, he says, the fact of God's unconsciousness throws a peculiar light on the doctrine of salvation. So a good God cannot allow evil to occur. Well, then how come these evil things happen to Job? And then Jung brings up the concept of God's unconsciousness. Well, a good God would not consciously allow evil things to occur, but maybe God has an unconscious mind wherein evil occurs automatically. And if that is the case, then we have a way of theoretically saving God's goodness while still accounting for the fact that evil does occur. The Theodicy of God's unconscious mind. We are skeletons in God's closet. So this is my interpretation of what Jung was implying with the idea of overcoming the problem of God's goodness and the existence of evil. So theodicy is a branch of theology that answers or discusses potential answers to the question, how can an all-powerful, all-good God allow evil? If God is all-powerful and all-good, then evil shouldn't exist. So either God is not all-powerful, but he is all-good, but simply doesn't have the power to prevent evil, or God is all-powerful, but he's not all-good, because he allows some evil to occur. But God cannot be all-powerful and all-good and still allow evil to exist. It seems to be a logical contradiction. So Jung's presenting the concept of God's unconscious mind as a way out of this conundrum. So I ask, if we are made in God's image, and we have an unconscious mind that dreams, so might God. Well, I didn't ask, I just put it out there as a possibility. If we are living in God's dream, so think of Mahavishnu in the Vedanta cosmology, then it is as if we are the skeletons in God's closet, acting out his, Vishnu's, and her, Lakshmi's, worst fears and repressions. We call the Radha, Krishna, Maya, Shiva quaternity. So let me stop there for a moment. So Mahavishnu, according to the Vaishnava branch of Hinduism, the entire megaverse of bubble universes is exhaling out from Mahavishnu as he sleeps and dreams on the causal ocean, which is a portion of the greater ocean of Brahman. We are living in God's dream. God's dream is unfolding in all of these bubble universes. Then Vishnu incarnates again in the center of each universe, and then once again the final Purusha avatar in the center of every material and spiritual atom. That's Paramatma. The point for this slide is that we are living in God's dream. So I say recall the Radha, Krishna, Maya, Shiva quaternity. Radha and Krishna are one. They are together God, And if we apply Jungian psychology to that person, then the conscious ego of Radha and Krishna each has a shadow. So Radha's shadow is Maya, and Krishna's shadow is Shiva, according to the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. I furthermore use Jung's concept of the anima and animus. The anima is the image of a woman in a man's collective unconscious mind. The animus is the image of a man in a woman's collective unconscious mind. Because Radha and Krishna are one person, his shadow Shiva is her animus, and her shadow Maya is Krishna's anima. But the point is, if we're living in God's dream, that means we're living in God's unconscious mind. And if you take that in the light of 20th century clinical psychology, and especially Freud and Jung's idea of dream analysis, then we're living in the realm of the psychic repressions and fears and fantasies that don't seem appropriate for the light of day in the spiritual planets, Vaikuntha Lokas, in the God-conscious realm. We're living in the place where all of God's nasty desires that he and she do not want to expose to the light of day are repressed, and all the fears and the terrors. That's what this material world is. So I ask, are you responsible for the evil deeds you do in your dreams? In your dreams, you might commit murder. You might steal something. You might do all kinds of unseemly things. Are you responsible morally for those actions? You might wake up feeling a little bit immoral, but you really didn't do anything. It was a dream. You did it unconsciously. Well, similarly, all of the horrors on the slaughter bench of history, which is what Hegel called the progress of God's idea of freedom through history, if that's all occurring in God's unconscious mind, then at least that seems to offer an avenue to relieve God of the moral responsibility for the horrors that occur down here on a regular basis. I say history is the dream analysis of God, which unites Hegel and Jung. So Hegel said history is the progress of God's spirit coming to a knowledge of itself through the human mind as it develops politically in states through history. And Jung says we should analyze our dreams because we gain guidance from the collective unconscious mind through these psychic images that we experience in our dreams. The ultimate archetype of the self produces the mandala image in our dreams and our fantasies, says Jung, and I'm saying that the physical correlate of the mandala image in dreams is black holes, nature's perfect mandala, with a geometrically perfect two-dimensional sphere encompassing a mathematical point. But the point for this slide is that if we're trying to take a leap of faith in the idea that we are these eternal, immortal heroes serving God on the cosmic stage, then we have to account for something that we all ask ourselves occasionally: why does God allow evil to occur? If you believe in God, then things might have happened to you, even petty little annoying things that you look up and you say, God, why did you do that to me? What are you doing? It's hard to surrender your life to serving God if you think that God is some kind of a petty tyrant, like a child with a magnifying glass killing ants. Why do you allow such seemingly unjust things to occur, God? That's the question that is raised by the book of Job in the Bible. So the idea of God's unconscious mind, it does provide an avenue of explanation for how evil can occur in the world despite God being all-powerful and all good. You might say, well, if God's all-powerful and he's omniscient, then how could he have an unconscious mind? How could an all-knowing being even have an unconscious mind? It's a good question. But then you could say to yourself, well, how could an all-powerful God not have an unconscious mind? If we can dream, but God can't, and we have something that God doesn't have. So if we look at ourselves as holographic projections from God, and if every point of the holographic film of the cosmic horizon contains all of the information of the whole, and if every point of the cosmic horizon is a gravitational singularity, and each of us is part and parcel of the absolute gravitational singularity, then all of the qualities we have must be rooted in the original qualities of God. If we have an unconscious mind, it seems that God does. And in fact, according to the Vaishnava Vedanta cosmology, we live in a megaverse of bubble universes, which is the expression of God's dream, which is God's unconscious mind. The Theodicy of God's unconscious mind, heaven is fueled by hell. So taking this speculation a step further, I say if God is the quantum vacuum, so the quantum vacuum consists of a singularity at each point, it's infinitely energetic, which means each point is a singularity, if God is the quantum vacuum, which is tearing itself apart and devouring itself voraciously in an infinitely hot sea of virtual particle-antiparticle creations and collisions that produce miniature black holes at the Planck scale, then it is plausible to suggest that God suffers schizophrenic disintegration into an infinitely deep chaos of psychosis or hell. So the quantum vacuum is infinitely hot. It's tearing itself apart constantly into antiparticle-particle pairs. It's ripping itself up into its constituent pairs of opposites, which then recombine and explode with fierce energy, creating a miniature black hole at every point of the quantum vacuum. It seems if the quantum vacuum is the collective unconscious mind, as Pim van Lommel, the cardiologist from the Netherlands who studied near-death experiences, said outright, and as I agree, because I say psyche equals singularity and the quantum vacuum's made of singularities, well, look at the nature of the quantum vacuum. It seems to be equivalent to many descriptions of hell. So continuing with the slide, Arjuna saw a glimpse of that in Krishna's universal form. So Krishna presented Arjuna with his universal form on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, and Arjuna saw all of the soldiers on the battlefield being gnashed by the flaming mouths and sharp teeth of Krishna's many thousands of heads which filled the sky. It seems to me it's a description of the all-devouring cosmic horizon. When he saw that, he realized, oh, this tiny little battlefield with these temporary material bodies that I'm so worried about killing, that's a joke. All of the planets and even the demigods are terrified by the fact that Krishna's devouring them at an alarming rate, so let's get on with the show. And then he was terrified. He said, Krishna, please take away this awful form. I don't want to see it anymore. It's freaking me out. Please let me see your beautiful two-armed flute-playing form as Krishna, which he then allowed him to see. So continuing in the slide, could it be that simply to endure the self-cannibalizing agony of fractal bifurcations, God fantasizes an eternal realm brimming with blissful inhabitants into being? I write here Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. In Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, he contemplates this kind of an idea, that God is this eternally tortured soul, and that to compensate for the horror of being ripped to shreds, he's talking about the god Dionysus, who was torn to bits by the Titans in the myth and then reassembled. So if God is constantly being ripped to pieces, which is a fact if God is the quantum vacuum, which is constantly ripping itself apart and devouring itself, then merely to endure that horrific plight, God automatically fantasizes this counterpoint, this realm of bliss and happiness and equanimity and beautiful forms, that to be able to endure God's own self, God as artistic genius creates a heaven, and that's how God deals with the ground of his own tortured being. Here's another quote from Nietzsche. Whoever has at some time built a new heaven has found the power to do so only in his own hell. And he's talking about a Brahmin who's suffered penance for 1,000 years, King Vishvamitra, to create a new heaven. But this is just linking the entire Vedanta cosmology especially into this idea of God's unconscious mind. If we're trying to serve God, we have to love God. But how can we love God if we think God is a petty tyrant who tortures us and tortures others? If we look at the suffering of the world as the manifestation of God's own suffering, God's own psychic turmoil, then we can endure the pain and suffering and see it not as God torturing us like a malevolent child tortures insects, but rather we are a part and parcel of God, and therefore we are experiencing God's own internal turmoil. We can embrace that and help God deal with God's own psychic agony by living a life with dignity and trying to bring order out of the chaos. And one of the ways to bring order out of the chaos is to analyze the world as if it is God's dream, as we're doing right here. And by focusing on the psyche equals singularity equation and the mandala that surrounds the singularity, according to Jung, that psychic image has the automatic quality of uniting opposites and bringing wholeness from opposites and bringing a state of psychic individuation. So by individuating ourselves, we are helping God and Goddess deal with their own internal strife and struggles, which is also manifest in the battle between the sexes. Just by engaging in our human life in a harmonizing way, which the Taoists say occurs automatically if you identify yourself with the Tao, which is described as a point reaching out far in space until it encompasses all of the constellations of the zodiac, which is again reminiscent of the gravitational singularity, if we identify ourselves with that, we help God achieve psychic balance. We help ourselves achieve psychic balance, and that's just one way that we can perform our cosmic heroics for God, by psychoanalyzing the entire history of the universe as if it is God's unconscious mind. The infinite speed of God's fantasy creating eternity. So here's some more speculation about how God might be creating existence as God's own artistic fantasy to compensate the internal torture of being constantly ripped into pairs of opposites that then recombine in this annihilating explosion. Maybe the spiritual illusion of the eternal heaven, Yogamaya, is fueled by the infinitely hot bubbling magma of the quantum vacuum, while the megaverse of material universes, Mahamaya, is the dream of that eternal fantasy. So, God is the quantum vacuum, that's the ground state. That infinitely hot hell sparks a fantasy of the counterpoint of the Vaikuntha Lokas, the eternal spiritual planets. And they are ruled by Yogamaya, spiritual illusion. So instead of seeing God as this bubbling sea of infinite energy that's ripping itself apart and recombining constantly, the inhabitants, which are parts and parcels of this quantum vacuum, see that bubbling sea of turmoil as a beautiful cowherd boy, for example, on Goloka Vrindavan. And they interact with each other in a paradise of species, all of which are completely God-conscious. And then that fantasy, which enables God to endure being God, which is the quantum vacuum, itself has an unconscious mind, which is the megaverse of material universes. So that's just a way of looking at the entire realm of the spiritual and material worlds and how they interact in the psychic dynamics. It's just analyzing Vedanta cosmology through a Jungian psychological lens. So I go on to write here, time stops at light speed and reverses at super light speed. So maybe it stops and reverses again as speeds approach infinity. So I quote here, or I cite Nature magazine, July 20, 2000. There was an experiment where a quantum wave of probability was measured to leave a detector tube before it entered. And I believe it was traveling 310 times faster than the speed of light. The particle nature wasn't traveling faster than light, but the wave nature was. At any rate, the point is, if you approach the speed of light, as you approach the speed of light, clocks on your spaceship would slow down, time would slow down for you, and at the speed of light, time would stop. I was hesitating there because I was just realizing if you're on the spaceship, your clock still looks like it's moving at normal speeds to you, but people who would look at your spaceship with a telescope, if they could see a clock through the window, and they would see its hands of the clock moving slower and slower. At any rate, the point is, the faster you go, the slower time goes. At light speed, time stops. Also, space stops because your length is contracted into a point. So if time stops at light speed, then faster than light speed, maybe it reverses. This one experiment indicated that it does. And if that's the case, and you keep going faster and faster, maybe there's a point where time stops again and reverses again. And if that's the case, then if you could go infinitely fast, then time would stop, turn around, stop again, turn around, stop, and it would be at each point on that cycle simultaneously, because infinite speed would mean it's at each point at the same time, an infinitely accumulating number of times at each instant. So let me just read here. Maybe God projects his compensatory fantasy at an infinite rate, which is equivalent to infinite gravity, thereby throwing it into the infinite past so that it always was, and back into the infinite future so that it always will be, and back around again and again. So I've always thought, well, if God's eternal, then all of God's pastimes are eternal. Well, then there's never anything new. How can God do new things if everything God does is eternal? Well, one way of getting around that seems to me a loophole implied in the laws of physics, is that God does things at an infinite speed, and even though when he starts doing them, they didn't exist, by doing them at an infinite rate, he's throwing them into the infinite past so that they always were. He rewrites history at each instant. So each new thing he does becomes an eternal fact of the infinite past, which, if God's omnipotent, it's a nice trick, it seems, that God could do that. So at any rate, continuing, at each instant, God's presence accumulates an infinite number of times at each point of the infinite expanse of space-time. And remember Blaise Pascal, from his book Pensées, he says, God is a point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. That's how God could be indivisible and yet omnipresent. How can God be everywhere and yet indivisible? Well, God's a point, traveling everywhere infinitely fast. He will be at each point simultaneously. Not only would God be at each point simultaneously, he would be accumulating at each point an infinite number of times at each instant simultaneously. The story here, or the picture of Radharani and Krishna in the center, and Krishna dancing with all of the other gopis. Radharani realizes, oh, I thought he was only dancing with me, but in fact, he's moving from one gopi to the next so swiftly that each of us thinks he's only dancing with us. So that just seems reminiscent of the idea of God traveling everywhere at an infinite speed.
I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple-choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.